Robin DiAngelo wrote a book. You've probably heard a lot about it. Apparently, it's been a number one seller for quite some time. White Fragility, which basically says if you're white, you're a racist. If you admit you're a racist, you're a racist. If you don't admit you're a racist, you're a racist. Basically, all roads lead to racism. So, is there any kind of intelligence or wisdom? I came across this interview. Let's find out a little bit more about her worldview and her background and see if there's anything to this kind of rhetoric.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race.
Okay, well, right off the bat, that's false. To be white is to be raised illiterate about race. This is projection. She was raised illiterate about race. Now, my guess is she grew up wealthy, private schools, all white schools, never really experienced any kind of diversity. Somebody who grew up in an inner city, went to public schools, certainly aren't ignorant about race, certainly had race. Intermarried couples obviously know something about race. People that worked in manufacturing, people in the military. Certainly, there's a lot of white people that are literate about race. So this is simply projection, since in her childhood she was completely illiterate about race. That means all white people are completely illiterate about race.
I am white, and part of being white is that I was not raised to see myself in racial terms.
So, since I'm white, I was raised not to see myself in racial terms, whatever that means. I mean, ideally, nobody should be seeing themselves in racial terms, but that's really hard to do with constant race baiters constantly dividing us. Think about your race, thinking about your race, thinking about your race. So now everybody is looking in the mirror and defining themselves by race, but that's not the way it should be.
I mean, I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. To be white is to see oneself outside of race.
What does that even mean? If you're white, then you have European descent. You're still part of some kind of race, some kind of ancestry, and obviously a lot of people are mixed. Um, Once again, this is projection from our own illiterate upbringing and elitist lifestyle.
To see oneself as a unique, special individual.
We should all see ourselves as unique, special individuals.
Exempt from the forces of socialization. I'll never forget a moment of standing beside a black man leading a workshop on race, and a white woman said to him, "I don't see color." He said, "Well, then how are you going to see racism?" Because
I get suspicious when I hear this. Oh, I was part of this conversation, and this person said something, this person said something, and you kind of wonder, did this really happen? I don't know for sure. I'm guessing it didn't, or it was something that she's building off of and kind of twisting some things around. To say I don't see in race means I don't treat black people any differently than I do white people. That's what it means.
because I am black, I do think you know that, and I have a different experience than you do, and you're not.
Everybody has a different experience than everybody else. Everybody has a different experience. So, and this gets into this identity politics, which he's obviously pushing. All white people are rich, and all black people are poor. And when we see somebody who's black, we shouldn't treat them like we would somebody who's white. We should treat them like some kind of lost puppy that needs rescuing. You don't know what kind of experience people had. And this idea to look at black people and assume they had a horrible childhood is absolutely ridiculous. There are black people that live in nicer houses than you do, than with not driving nicer cars than you do. We have no idea. There are black people out there that grew up with both parents that were successful, have never been poor, and always have had the best of everything. So this idea, once again, when we see someone who's black, we're supposed to give them our sympathy and treat them like they need rescuing. That is racist. And I think that's what's so ironic with elitists like this, is how racist they are. What I see here is somebody who's a racist understands that they're a racist. And in order to make themselves feel better, it's like, well, all white people are racist. I believe that this is a elitist white woman in an ivory tower who's lived a really sheltered life, who's arrogant enough to project herself on all white people, and she does it to make herself feel better about what a racist that she is. But there's no benefit in what she's doing. There's no benefit in what she's preaching. What she's preaching, the only thing it does is divide people even further by race. What she's doing is wrong. This kind of identity politics and thinking is ignorant, and it just divides people further.
You're not going to be able to understand that, and you're not going to be able to support the parts of that experience that are really painful and problematic if you refuse to acknowledge my reality.
Okay, what's your reality? Just because you're black doesn't mean you grew up poor in the ghetto and your mother was a drug addict or whatever. Or is that what white people are supposed to think of all black people? Everybody has different childhood experiences.
I don't see color is really a way of saying I refuse to acknowledge your reality.
No, it simply means I'm not going to treat you, whether it's true or not. To say I don't see color means I'm not going to treat you any differently than I would anybody else. I'm guessing she doesn't, by the way.
What's important about that narrative is it reveals what the person thinks racism is. So if the person is using proximity, fondness across race as evidence of a lack of racism, in order for that to be good evidence, a racist must not be able to do that. So that rests on an understanding that a racist cannot tolerate proximity to people of color. And I'm hoping that we can see that's pretty absurd, because trust me, even avowed racists can tolerate being around people.
If an avowed racist has a whole bunch of black friends, they're probably not a very good racist. And I'm guessing this is projection against people who have black friends, because I'm guessing she doesn't have any.
People of color, and often are. You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue.
According to who? You can't talk about any issue. You can't talk about television, movies, politics. No, everything's got to be focused on race. How absurd is this statement? And these are just the race baiters. Racism, 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 racism. And what does it do? It just drives us further apart. It is division.
And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table.
And once again, this is somebody who's an elitist, I'm sure, grew up with money, has tons of money, has always had tons of money, an elitist saying it's not about class. Well, but her worldview, her ivory tower, her living such a sheltered life with being so ignorant about race because she only grew up with other wealthy white people, that the class has absolutely, the class has a lot to do with it. When we see the division, we do see a division in wealth between black and white, and that is a division that needs to close. Now, obviously, there's a lot of successful black people out there, a lot of successful black women. Black women are the most educated segment of our society. The one with the most degrees and higher degrees are black women. But that gap has to close. And obviously, we're seeing that gap close. We've made a tremendous amount of progress over the last 60 years. But we do have to look at income. Income is the greatest divider in this country. The greatest divider by far is income, is wealth. But once again, if you're rich, you don't want to make it about wealth. You don't want to make it about class. You want to make it about rich. If you're wealthy, you want everybody fighting about race. That's exactly what you want if you're wealthy.
First of all, we're already divided by race. And focusing on race is not what did it.
Well, we're more divided by race because of people like this.
I would say not focusing on race, refusing to grapple with how race shapes virtually everything is what keeps us divided. And that is a very white narrative. All of those narratives function to get race off the table, close the exploration, exempt the person from any further engagement, and protect the racial hierarchy and the white position with it, which is an unequal hierarchy. The challenge I want to offer my fellow white people is
my fellow white people.
changing the question from if to how. So dominant culture asks if I'm racist. And I want to change that question to how have I been shaped by the forces of racism? How is racism manifesting in my life? Because it circulates 24/7, 365. None of us can be and none of us were.
Race baiting, race baiting, race baiting. What society does racism not exist? What society has racism never existed? Who is the United States being compared to? Obviously, we have instances of racism. Obviously, we have a lot of racism in our history, but we also have a tremendous amount of progress that people like this will never talk about. A tremendous amount of progress over the last 60 years. This country has never been less racist. You look at all the interracial marriages we have. You look at all the people now of mixed descent. More and more and more people of mixed descent that are hopefully knowing that this is just a bunch of garbage that people like this are selling.
Exempt from its forces. And this is where individualism can come in. I have a particular...
Individualism? What she's preaching has nothing to do with individualism. Individualism as a societal philosophy is emphasis on the individual, meaning your ancestors don't mean anything. Because in individualism, you are to be treated by your words and your actions as an individual. Once everyone who's born, they get a clean slate. Then they are judged. If your parents and grandparents, if your ancestors were the greatest people in the world, if they were the worst people in the world, it doesn't matter. Individualism is the opposite of this identity politics that she's preaching.
Story, but that story didn't exempt me. And so I can ask myself, how did all the things I see as unique about me set me up into the overall racist structure? Because it did.
Once again, what I see here is an elitist racist that hates herself. So in order to make her feel better, she writes this book about how, oh, well, all white people are like me. Well, they're not. Not all white people are like this elitist, racist woman. I think she's horrible. I think what she's preaching is divisive. She never has any kind of solutions or any kind of end game to this. It is eternal guilt and victimhood that people like her are preaching. And I think it's disgusting. And what really disturbs me is how many people that I consider, I consider anybody eating this garbage to be weak-minded and gullible. I can't help but to think this way. I don't care if she has a PhD. I'm not impressed by anybody's degrees. Nothing against fancy degrees. I've worked with people that had high degrees that were incredibly intelligent and competent. I've worked with other people with higher degrees that I wouldn't trust to run a lemonade stand without screwing it up. So I don't care about her PhD. It means absolutely nothing to me. I have seen what she's about in other interviews she's done and reviews I've seen with this book. And on this interview, this is a divisive, destructive person, and people like her are hurting this country, and they're hurting white people, and they're hurting black people. This does not do us any good. We should focus on the tremendous progress that's been made over the last 60 years. We should talk about how we closed the gap. We should talk about better schools, education in inner cities, and we do need to talk about responsibility. Family responsibility ultimately is what's needed for any society to do better. It's got to come from the culture. It has to be a culture of success. But this kind of rhetoric just preaches a culture of victimhood, which doesn't help anybody. So this doesn't help anybody. We need to do better. We need to get better leaders. We need to get better intelligence and wisdom in colleges. My gosh, this is the kind of crap that kids are being indoctrinated with. No wonder we're seeing all the issues that we have been. I mean, if this is what's going on in colleges, don't send your kids to college. Shut those colleges down. This is poison. We need for colleges to stop with this poison. Anyway, that's my take on it. Please share yours. This is Jim Wall. Thanks for watching. Until next time.
Cisco, do we have to leave all our good friends now?
Only until next time, Pancho. Adios, amigos.